What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my first impressions of Risen, the second series from Piranha Bytes, the developer behind the Gothic series as well as the more recent Elix series, and I've been making my way through their catalog of games here recently, as I originally played Elix and loved that game and was just very curious about what else the studio had done. So given that I started in a weird place, I've been jumping around a little bit, in case you're wondering why I'm covering this one before Gothic 3. But Gothic 3 is actually somewhat important to Risen despite it being technically a different series, because the first thing you should probably know about Risen is that it's connected to Gothic in everything but literal name. Towards the end of the Gothic series, Piranha Bytes had a bit of a falling out with its publisher at the time called Jowood, a company that no longer exists. And because of this, Piranha Bytes temporarily lost their rights to the Gothic series until roughly around the time that Risen 2 was completed. And because of this sort of weird situation, it looks like they just stripped all of the direct connections to the Gothic series out. But the setup to Risen is essentially one of the endings to Gothic 3, which sees gods being driven from the world. But in their place, something has risen, causing storms across the land, and more specifically, a ship that your character is on gets attacked by one and you wind up shipwrecked on the Isle of Faranga, which naturally becomes the epicenter of events for the game in classic Piranha Bytes fashion. Now right away though, probably my biggest takeaway from Risen 1 is that it does such a great job of introducing you to all the aspects of the game. And I don't mean through like tutorials, but rather the way the initial questing is set up. And while it can be a little railroady at times, much of that first chapter does just a fantastic job of very naturally introducing you to concepts that are often seen in Piranha Bytes games, such as the way their combat systems work, the way their factions and joining a faction and how important that is gets worked out, etc. But of all the Piranha Bytes games I've played so far, I can honestly say that Risen 1 I think does this the best. Now, that's not completely without its faults. I did want to say that Risen 1 eases you into the game much better than their other titles that I've played. Though I did mention factions, and an oddity here is that this particular game technically only has two factions. There's the Bandits, and then the Inquisition. Now, typically with Piranha Bytes games, you can pick one of three orders or factions to join, and then this kind of gives you a playstyle or build. And that's still pretty much the case here, except one of them is split into two different orders, which allows you to pick between being a warrior or a mage, depending on how you approached that faction. And for the most part it works, it's just a little bit odd. But another cool thing here is that we can see the beginnings of the systems we would later see in Elix that I think made that game really great. For instance, crafting is a big part of Risen 1, not that it wasn't in the previous titles, but it could in many instances be ignored with little to no worries, whereas here, if you get into alchemy, you can start brewing up potions that will give you permanent stat increases pretty quickly. Making use of smithing has given me the best weapon that I've come across in the game so far, by a pretty wide margin, and they even made some interesting changes to how magic works. But naturally, like most other Piranha Bytes games, who has access to it largely comes down to which faction you wind up joining, but it's separated into crystal and runic magic. Runic magic is the same that we saw in the Gothic series, but the crystal magic is effectively three different basic magic attacks that you can level up separately to use specifically for combat. These are usually low mana cost attacks that you can spam at enemies, whereas the runic magic is the more interesting stuff like summoning creatures, turning yourself into other creatures, more utility focused spells, that kind of thing. But that particular bit of magic is the hardest to get to because you have to join the Inquisition. Not only that, you have to volunteer, because another really weird thing this game does is that the Inquisition has a very tight grip on the island as they're trying to deal with the storms that are racking the island, dealing with the Titans and everything. And for the first chapter, it is illegal to be outside of the town for any citizen, which means if the warriors of the order catch you, they'll knock you out and drag you to the monastery to force you to join up, basically. And this serves as a little tutorial. However, if you want to be a mage, you actually need to go through a separate quest line, get recommended, and go join the order voluntarily. which will then give you the option of becoming a mage, which is a sort of interesting way to handle that. But that said, even a warrior of the order can still get the crystal magic, just not the runic stuff. And even the bandits can get the crystal magic, but you gotta jump through some hoops from what I understand, as the bandits naturally tend to focus a bit more on thieving, as well as traditional weaponry. And while each of these factions can certainly determine your overall playstyle a little bit, another great thing they do is offer some mutually exclusive content, which as always adds a little bit of replayability, at least for the bulk of the beginning of the game, as much of the story kind of comes together towards the end. But the first chapter is pretty highly variable depending on how you tackle it, which is making for some interesting times on my part, seeing how everything varies and pans out. But just a few other things I want to mention before we kind of leave this off, but if you couldn't tell, I've been pretty excited to play this one. That said, like all Piranha Bytes games, this one is definitely prone to min-maxing, as much of their games use the same fundamental systems, with training points, learning things from trainers, etc., which allows you to abuse it once you know what's going on, especially when you start learning the itemization. Just to give a quick example, many of the skills in this game have tiers to them, but a few of the skills only have the one tier. You either know how to sneak or you don't. And you can find a ring in the game that will just give you the 1 point of sneak and thus allow you to do so. And you can get one relatively early on for free if you have a shovel, provided you know where it is. And the second you know that it's pointless to spend any training points on sneak, because you can get it effectively for free whenever you want, and sneak is pretty situational in a game where you're mostly outside fighting monsters anyway. So little things like that can be very optimized, but one thing I've really enjoyed is that the world is remarkably open, and this is something that Piranha Bytes games have always been very good at. That is to say, making games without a ton of loading screens, which does make the world feel a bit more alive when I can walk in and around the harbor town out into the rest of the world without even so much as having to load up an interior, etc. And for the time at which this game released, that was pretty impressive. But the last thing I want to leave you guys with is, if you are unaware, Risen 1 recently got an update that brought some added support to its Steam release, as well as saw its release onto consoles. This is part of an effort by THQ Nordic, who bought Piranha Bytes in, I believe it was 2019, to sort of update a lot of their older titles and make them playable on modern hardware, etc. The Gothic series has seen similar updates, but Risen 1 in particular saw controller support added, as well as achievements added to Steam directly as opposed to just in-game. But on top of that, they also took the time to fix a handful of bugs as well that were known and prominent, as well as made it use 64-bit. And they even added cloud saves, which will be especially helpful when I go to play this on Steam Deck for the review. And while this update certainly didn't change the fundamentals of the game or anything, it was a nice update for an aging title that I was actually waiting on before I covered this one. All of that out of the way, if you couldn't tell, I've been really enjoying playing Risen so far. I'm excited to dive into this one. I've been looking forward to it for a while. And so far, the game has certainly not disappointed. I've enjoyed it quite a bit. And unless the ending really drops the ball, I don't really see that changing too much. But we'll have to see how this one pans out, because it's my understanding that Risen 2 and 3 were not as loved as this first one is, but we'll see about those when I get there. For now, though, I'm enjoying Risen 1. The full review will likely be out early next week or so, but it's pretty clear that I'm enjoying it. But with all of that out of the way, I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.